Thank you and welcome to everyone coming to COVID and Students at Risk. So I'm Boyda Johnstone. I'm an assistant professor of Borough of Manhattan Community College, and I will just jump straight into the introductions because time is of the essence. So our first presenter is Dr. Naomi Edwards, who's an assistant professor of English at Suffolk County Community College in Brentwood, New York. Her teaching and research focus on multi-ethnic literature of the United States, and her talk this morning is entitled Radical Empathy in the Pandemic Classroom and Beyond. I've also made the three of you co-hosts just in case you are planning to share your screen, but no pressure. So take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Boyda, and thanks for hosting us all today. So this is Radical Empathy in the Pandemic Classroom and Beyond. In the face of all the disruptions and uncertainties of COVID-era education, students have been coping with a wide array of challenges to their learning, from grief and mourning to job loss and financial crisis, eviction, lack of childcare, mental health issues, lack of access to and familiarity with technology, and the list just goes on and on. Watching my students struggle with these and other challenges for the past 2 years has pushed my empathy for students to new levels and changed my teaching in ways I did not anticipate. The presentation focuses on ways my pedagogical practice has changed during the COVID era to better adapt to student needs, connect students to academic and personal supports, and ultimately see and treat them as human beings first and students second. Through weekly check-ins, flexible deadlines, and consistent understanding and support, I convey empathy for my students, and they become more likely to reach out for help when they need it, and more likely to succeed academically in my courses. The practices I developed during emergency remote instruction, I now see as a bedrock for my pedagogical philosophy moving forward, which I've come to think of as a pedagogy of radical empathy. Even before COVID, I thought of myself as overall an empathetic and compassionate teacher, but I still clung to attendance policies, point deductions for late assignments, and cutoff dates for submission of work. I had framed this in my mind as fair, as upholding necessary standards of rigor and professionalism that students needed to learn and practice. I also made room for exceptions to these policies in extreme cases. If students asked for an extension or requested that some absences be excused for one reason or another. I thought this was a reasonable way to maintain a general standard for my expectations, but still allow for compassion and flexibility when it was warranted. But of course, a key problem with that approach is that it reveals an arbitrariness to these kinds of course policies and can also inadvertently lead to or exacerbate inequities in the classroom. This approach inevitably leads to situations in which only the students with the confidence and wherewithal to ask for grace are granted it. Shy students, socially anxious students, students struggling with a deep sense of shame and humiliation about their shortcomings as a student, first-generation students, students who have a history of being ignored or belittled by their teachers, will be less likely to seek out help or expect to be met with compassion when they do. So they disappear. They stop coming to class, stop submitting, stop responding to emails, and withdraw from the course or take the F. In March 2020, when we all shifted to emergency remote instruction, I of course let go of all those course policies and operated with maximum flexibility and leeway. The chaos of that time demanded it. Situated at the global epicenter of the pandemic, the majority of my students saw a family member hospitalized or killed by COVID-19 that semester. Deadlines simply did not matter to me or to them. As a means of at least keeping in regular touch with my students, even those unable to regularly submit work, I set up a weekly journal on Blackboard for students to check in with me and just let me know how they were holding up under the stay-at-home order and what was going on in their lives. I said it was their space to use as they wished, to process, to vent, to share positive stories, to ask questions, or reach out for help. In those frightening and uncertain early pandemic days, after putting my then 3-year-old and 6-month-old to bed, I would sit down at my computer each night and read my students' journals and weep. One student lost his father and his uncle within days of each other. Another lost her grandmother who raised her. Another student shared her stomach turning worry for her mother, who was a nurse on a COVID floor at the university hospital. One of my favorite students was terrified because she and her father were both severely immunocompromised, but her brother, who lived with them, was an essential worker and venturing out into the danger every day risking their exposure to the virus. More and more stories came in from my students every day of entire households being laid off from their jobs, of severe depression and anxiety, of harassment and burnout at their jobs as essential workers, of watching family members be hospitalized, unsure of whether they'd ever see them again. Through what was then titled the Coronavirus Journal, I got a window into my students' lives like I'd never had before. And they seemed to really need and really appreciate having that space to maintain a one-on-one connection, despite our move to asynchronous online instruction. For a lot of my students during that first COVID semester, the weekly journal assignment was the only one they completed for the rest of the semester. I've kept the weekly journal assignment going in my online courses ever since, retitling it, No Really, How Are You Doing? Rather than an explicit coronavirus journal as it was initially, in its subsequent iteration, I explain it to students as a weekly check-in with me. In the assignment instructions, I describe it as an informal space for you to discuss with me privately any concerns you have about the course, any issues you are struggling with, or information you would like me to have about your circumstances. You may also use the journal as a free writing or brainstorming space for writing assignments, or even a space to vent or write about your life. The purpose of the weekly journal is to maintain consistent contact with me, and it gives me a way to check in with you on a regular basis to make sure you're doing okay. Even as we've adapted over the past 2 years to the quote unquote new normal, and even as COVID restrictions have eased and many have regained some semblance of stability and normalcy, my students continue to really take to the journal assignment. I continue to learn about the complex lives they're leading, the pressing demands that make balancing their coursework with everything else in their lives so difficult. Though the original coronavirus journal was eye-opening and witnessing in real time the far-reaching traumatic impacts of the pandemic's first wave, its longer-term impact on me was the realization that, pandemic or not, our students are always experiencing disruptions to their lives and to their learning, and are fundamentally deserving of empathy, patience, and support. Yes, in March 2020, it was COVID, but it was also childcare, which was a struggle for student parents before the pandemic and continues to be a struggle for them. And it was financial insecurity, which has always been and will continue to be an incredible source of stress and disruption for community college students, most of whom work while they attend school. And it was struggles with mental health, which are now at epidemic levels among our students. In a recent survey of 1,700 college students, 88% said that there's a mental health crisis at colleges and universities right now. And 70% of respondents reported feeling emotional distress or anxiety. Student reports of these barriers to their focus and their learning have continued to come up in the journal repeatedly over the past 2 years. In response to hearing these stories and seeing the range of demands and crises and responsibilities and hardships my students are facing while trying to advance their education, I've let go of those attendance policies and hard deadlines and late penalties. They serve no one. But more importantly, they represent to me now a kind of disregard for the humanity of my students. I seek to be a supportive partner in their learning. And for me, that has necessarily translated into a pedagogy rooted in compassion and flexibility. I still set due dates on assignment sheets and in Blackboard, and most students still meet them. But I always contextualize those due dates as an ideal, with an acknowledgement that things happen, things get in the way, and when that happens, I am here to help them without judgment and without penalty. Just this week, a student who failed to submit an essay 2 weeks ago and then stopped coming to class finally came back and stayed after class to speak with me. She told me she was ashamed and embarrassed and didn't know how to get back on track or if it would even be worth it. She told me she was ready to just give up because she felt like she had already failed. Until I sent an outreach email to her last week to say that I noticed she hadn't submitted the essay and that I was writing to check in and make sure she was okay. I reminded her that she could still submit the essay without penalty, and I offered to meet with her to help her get back on track with the course. Sometimes just a simple reassurance that their success and their dignity are more important to me than a due date is enough to bring them back into the fold. We had a 30-minute Zoom conference the next day to go over her rough draft together, and she expects to submit the essay next week. In conversations about empathy in the classroom, compassion is sometimes framed as the enemy of rigor or a detriment to students' ability to take personal responsibility. I disagree. Though I've let go of those punitive policies, students still ultimately have to complete the work one way or another. And by providing flexibility through extended due dates, essay rewrites, it helps keep students invested in their learning as an ongoing process that very often includes mistakes and even outright failures. A missed deadline in this context then doesn't mean failure and shame and retreating into absenteeism or academic withdrawal. It means re-engaging in the learning process through identifying problems and working collaboratively as a team to create a solution. When I can frame my role as an ally or a partner in their learning, rather than an authority figure casting judgment on them, students become more open to trying again in the face of obstacles and missteps in their coursework. And I can still hold their work to high academic standards, even when they've taken more time or stopped and started or had to rewrite an assignment. Another common complaint I see about this approach to the student-teacher relationship is that this is coddling students or infantilizing them, that it fails to prepare them for the quote unquote real world in which their bosses and colleagues won't tolerate this kind of behavior and won't treat them with this kind of leniency. I disagree with this as well for a couple of reasons. First of all, our students are already very much living in this quote unquote real world of which their college education is a part. And second, this kind of leniency happens constantly in that real world. Just last month, I asked 2 editors to whom I owed an essay manuscript if I could have a 1-week extension so I could use my spring break to complete the essay. And they responded cheerfully that yes, of course I can have an extra week, it's no problem at all. Similarly, in our own scholarly work, we face requests to revise and resubmit, for example. Supporting our students, acknowledging their humanity, truly empathizing with the ways their experiences shape who they are in our classroom and what they can accomplish on any given day is not coddling. It's not failing to prepare them for the quote unquote real world. It's developing a classroom that honors the values of mutual respect and growth. As teachers of literature, certainly one of our goals must be to help students build empathy for others. And modeling that practice is one of our most powerful tools. I don't see my primary task as a teacher of literature and writing to prepare students to simply join a real world that will lack empathy for their struggles and have them conform to those values of distance, disconnection, and demand. No. Let's show our students the ways we might ourselves make that real world more loving, more supportive, more compassionate. Let's show them that failure need not be final, that learning is a lifelong process, that struggle is inevitable and something we all share, though by no means equally. When we lead with and model radical empathy in the classroom, we open up opportunities not only for our students to succeed in their coursework and become better students, but to become better citizens, better people who might look at that so-called real world out there and start to imagine it otherwise, start to work on remaking it into a more just and compassionate world, a world perhaps of radical empathy. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Naomi. That was really lovely note to start on. So I do see we have all 4 presenters here, so we're going to jump right into the next presentation, which is from Dr. Jessica Arujo, who's an assistant professor at the Community College of Rhode Island. She holds an MA in literature and an MFA in creative writing from William Patterson University, and her talk is entitled Student Retention Through Student Responsibility in the Time of COVID-19.
Good morning, good morning. Thank you. Okay. Let me- okay. So one of the issues presented by this pandemic is that our students are faced with so many new harsh realities that it is hard to keep them engaged and motivated to stay in school, to stay in our classes, especially when there's so much going on in their personal lives. And the aim of this paper is to try to increase student retention while not diminishing the responsibility they have for their learning. So I'll begin. Teaching literature in the time of COVID to community college students has proved difficult, not just because students are carrying the emotional and physical weight of a global pandemic, but also because they are attempting to adapt to a college learning environment through a screen or from behind a mask, socially distanced in a classroom, ready to self-quarantine any minute if they or someone in the room tests positive. They must learn to operate in a new normal that involves policies that can, change at the drop of a dime in adapting to whatever new situation happens in the pandemic. And all while they're trying to focus on understanding, analyzing, and writing about literature and take all of the other classes as well. Many community college students simply stop showing up at some point during a 15-week semester, and many do not return the next semester. Research shows there's a concerning drop in student persistence and retention that we must address, since at public two-year institutions, the retention rate for full-time students fell 2.7% over the pandemic, right? Even in the fall 2021, English enrollment dropped 8.3% after a 14.3% drop in the fall 2020, compared to only a 4.8% drop in the fall 2019. So this paper seeks to argue that the key to student retention through this pandemic and beyond is increasing student responsibility in the classroom through labor grading, multimodality, and reflection. By employing different ways to engage with literary texts and by offering students opportunities to reflect on their own roles and responsibilities, instructors will alter the student-professor dynamic, repositioning that relationship and increasing student engagement in a way that will lead to greater retention. So during the pandemic, many institutions implemented a pass-fail policy to alleviate the challenges involved in the scramble to transition to online learning. The pass-fail policy at many institutions only lasted 1 or 2 semesters, with some institutions even just implementing it as an option the second semester, even though the adverse effects of the pandemic still continue today. As students return to campus, navigating a new normal, retention still poses a challenge. And one possible solution to student retention is labor grading, also sometimes known as ungrading or contract grading, where the students' final grade are determined by the work they put into the course. Many advocates of eliminating grades or ungrading argue that the problem with grades is a serious question of how to understand the grades of learners with different beginning baselines. So if someone begins with a good bit of knowledge and doesn't put in effort, but ends higher than someone who started with no knowledge, worked very hard, and made great strides, how should they be evaluated? Not all students have access to the same resources, and they do not all come to our courses at the same level. And in the pandemic, that has been magnified based on the circumstances of the groups of populations that were affected adversely. So added to the fact of what they were experiencing prior to the pandemic exacerbated that. So traditional grading methods hurt student retention because, as Jesse Stommel writes, grades incentivize the wrong stuff. The product over the process, what the teacher thinks over what the student thinks. Because the traditional grading format has the instructor assigning a grade to student work, the product. The student is more inclined to curry favor with their instructors without really focusing on learning. In a literature course, this can look like discussions or essays aimed at what students think the instructor wants to read, as opposed to they're engaging in a critical thinking and analysis based on their own insights. They see the end goal, the grade, and are only extrinsically motivated in their work. And the problem with extrinsic motivation is that if they receive or think they'll receive a low grade, they are led to believe they lack ability. And this belief leads them to attribute their difficulties to a defect in themselves about which they cannot do a great deal. So they retire hurt, avoiding investing in effort in learning, which could lead to disappointment. Consequently, when a student's extrinsic motivation is exhausted, they may stop putting in any effort, and they just may stop showing up at all. Labor grading emphasizes that the effort and the rewards, right, by allowing students to see their agency in their learning. In labor grading, a grade is based on something that a student can clearly measure, their labor exerted on the assignment. Therefore, motivation is intrinsic, based on their own motivation. In a literature classroom, this intrinsic motivation can be fostered through assignments that encourage risk-taking and vulnerability in their engagement with text. Since it is the labor of engaging and the process of working with the text and peers that will produce the final grade. In the end, students will see the direct relationship between their labor and their grade and will have to assume responsibility, which is encouraged by their intrinsic motivation. In other words, my success depends on the goals I set and achieve. Multimodality can be another way to encourage intrinsic motivation and increase student retention. Like labor grading, having students learn to convey meaning using mixed modes of communication offers them an opportunity to experiment and control their learning process. Like labor grading, a multimodal approach resists traditional frameworks that cater to specific identities, particularly individuals who have geographic, socioeconomic, and racial advantages in US higher education. Students can express their creativity in ways that are not simply limited to print, which is more like the way they consume information within and outside the academic setting. Takayoshi himself writes, for students, such instruction is often refreshing because it's different from the many other composing instruction experiences they've had, meaningful because the production of multimodal text in class resemble many of the real-life text students encounter in digital spaces, and relevant because students often sense that multimodal approaches to composing will matter in their lives outside of the classroom. Too often, students question how the material covered in class will benefit them in the long term beyond that particular class. Real-world applications are necessary, and incorporating multimodal assignments can help bridge the gap between the student's perception of school and what the real world is. Emphasizing how learning in the course will extend beyond the assignments and the course will encourage students to take on the responsibility for their learning, especially in courses that couple multimodality and labor grading. Shane Wood argues for a departure from traditional grading in multimodal classes because traditional frameworks limit student agency by further cultivating cultural hegemony and marginalizing already marginalized voices, catering to academic expectations. We cannot expect students to find creative and meaningful ways to communicate if they are still tied to a letter grade that places judgment on their final product. Grading the work done on a multimodal assignment will help motivate students to enjoy the process of learning and using different modes of communication. In a literature class, these modes can look like a video research paper, mixing a skit of a reinterpretation of a text with literary critique, something a student may not risk doing if they are solely in pursuit of a letter grade. Finally, the third component to student retention through student responsibility is to incorporate reflection to promote an understanding of their progress in the class. Reflection, whether it be in the form of reflective essays, process letters, trackers, etc., helps students see how much responsibility is entailed in a labor-based structure class where the onus is on the process, not the product. Even in traditional grading framework, reflection has been shown to be effective by providing students opportunities to practice self-regulation and providing students with opportunities to connect their actions to their outcomes. Students must be able to process how their actions affect their grade. But in a traditional framework, this may not be immediately clear to the student because of the control that they perceive the teacher has over the grade. In the traditional framework, if a student gets a C on a paper, they can attribute it to different variables. The teacher is a hard grader, the teacher doesn't like them, etc. But using reflection in a labor-based grading structure, the student must self-reflect, often facing the reality of responsibility by having to answer questions about their production of labor or lack thereof. Students analyze their own participation, attendance, late assignments, and other labor requirements. Reflection on the process of production is important to implement early in the semester, so the students can recognize their own responsibility in their success and be able to practice self-assessing the effort they put into their process. Implementing reflection early on helps students think about what they know or what they have learned while they identify areas of confusion so they can create new goals. As instructors, we may inadvertently take on more of the responsibilities for our students' grades, especially when we see the students stop showing up weeks into the semester or more students getting lower grades. But the key is to show students how their learning is their responsibility and how our classes are valuable to their goals. And we can use reflection to foster metacognitive thinking that reinforces that. Students, like instructors, are in transition. We still don't know the full effects of the pandemic on higher education, but we can take this time to change or eliminate frameworks that were not serving the majority of students to begin with. And if we continue to maintain those frameworks, we won't be able to prevent alienating students from their own education. Labor-based grading, multimodality, and reflection can help engage and retain students by showing them that the responsibility of learning is on them. And with that responsibility comes freedom, creativity, and deeper learning. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jessica. That was wonderful. And maybe I don't need to give the 2-minute warnings because you're all doing great with time. So we'll move right on to Meredith Randall, who is art historian and curator who works to find new spaces for art. She has curated exhibitions on 4 continents, from the South African National Gallery to the Sao Paulo Biennial, and taught on 2. She is a writer who has written broadly about contemporary art, from the catalog for the First Land Art site-specific group show in South Africa to the Bag Factory. She was the founding curator for the Robert Balin Photography Foundation. She also set up a program working with township schools in South Africa using photography to teach higher order thinking. Currently, she is an adjunct lecturer in the BMCC Music and Art Department, and her talk today is entitled Illiteracy and Engagement, a Case Study.
Hi. I don't know if this problem I'm dealing with is new here. I'm not sure that COVID made this problem worse. It just happened during the time of COVID. And I'm at BMCC as a community college. We accept anyone and everyone into the community colleges, as we all do. And at BMCC, 1 art history or history of music class is required to graduate. This is one of the facts I like being at BMCC. In my student body, there's everything from early childhood development students to criminal justice majors to the students who are just trying to figure out their path. And I get to share with them the art and show them why these objects are relevant and interesting. And hopefully in the process, it makes them feel smarter and capable. And at the community college, most often it's the first time many of my students are seeing these objects. So I try to structure the class with piles of scaffolding so students learn to build their argument, make hypotheses, and then get on to crafting detailed visual analysis and supporting them with facts, ideally from good sources. But a lot of the art I teach is fundamentally weird and wacky, and my students have never seen anything before like it. I try to find connections where I can to build on the knowledge they have. And there are some students that we don't connect with, no matter how hard I try. In the fall of 2021, was my first class back in first person. Personally, I was really excited for it. It faced the problems that community colleges are facing, really low registration. I had just the cutoff of 17 students registered for it. My first class, I think 8 showed up. And then there was some drop off as well. My hardest working student, I'm going to give her the boring name of Nancy. She is from Bangladesh. She moved to the US 11 years ago now, when she was 9 in 4th grade. She always came early to class. Her homework was always completed. She didn't say anything in the class. If I asked a direct question to comment on the conversation we're having, she could barely speak audibly. I would come in really, really close, trying to tease out her words. She clearly wasn't following. She seemed painfully shy. She didn't like to speak out loud. It wound up being a really small class, and I try really hard to build conversation, to build community. It's easier, I think, for most students to talk about art and then to get to the difficult part about writing about it. So in this process of teaching the students how to think critically, first we talk and then we write. The textbook, the first homework is to read their textbook, to find a quote and tell me what it means. The class last semester I'm referring to was a modern and contemporary art history class. We use Arneson and Mansfield's History of Modern Art. It's one of the more popular accounts for this class. I asked the students to find a quote in the textbook as the first assignment to illustrate what was radical about Manet's Olympia. To find a quote, write the quote down, put a citation on it, and summarize what the quote means. It's a basic assignment to check in that 1, they all have their textbooks. 2, they all read it. And 3, they have some understanding of what they're reading. Trying for a low stakes way, so they all get into the groove of reading this book, participating in the class, and get in the habit of writing about art. And the first few homeworks to practice this understanding. Literally, I just want them to demonstrate they can read and understand. And then you could build on to higher order thinking skills such as critical analysis. And it catches the students who can't get the book, so we can talk about the library and all the ways to get the free copies. And there's students, for the issues, you try to focus on this. But this conference today, I want to speak about this student, Nancy. She didn't seem to understand the homework question. On her second try, after I explained she needs to read the book and find a quote that talks about Manet and what's radical about him, she came back with Manet was in the question and gave a random sentence from the first paragraph in the book about Manet. And her summary was this bizarre rewriting using words that she seemed to pick out of a thesaurus that just missed the mark. When I chatted her later about it, I offered her another chance to redo it. She eagerly took it. Her third attempt was equally poor, no better than the first, but somehow demonstrated real effort. This went on for a few weeks more. She came to every class early, stayed late, asking how to redo her homework to make it better. Her homework was just incomprehensible, and the redos were no better. BMCC has the reporting process. It's called Connect to Success. And it's, I don't usually have very success with it. Usually I get an email a few weeks later from some advisor saying they've reached out and the issue's resolved, but there's no discernible difference. So I usually try to reach out to advisors and asking for help. And usually you can connect with someone specifically and you can contact the student and try to find a different. I started writing the usual process of emails and nothing was hitting. And Nancy, this dear student, she never got discouraged. She continued to come to class every week. Every week she did her homework. Every week she handed in she redid the homeworks. Every week I went over it with her, trying to help her understand. Every week I was trying to pull her into the class discussions. Nothing was working. I asked her about her other classes. She was taking English. I said to myself, an English professor, maybe they'll have more insight. I'm not an English professor. And this is how I met my dear Mina. So I reached out and asked Mina Steinkohler what her experience with the students. We were on the same page. Fortunately, Mina is not an adjunct here at BMCC, and she knows the system better than I do. So with her guidance, I continue to write emails after class each week, after our discussions, looking for support. It was a ridiculous amount of emails. I never have worked so hard to find help for a student, so fruitlessly. There was no improvement whatsoever. Mostly I felt like a failure. After many attempts, I eventually hooked up with the amazing team at BMCC at the ELC Writing Lab and Josh Belknap, who formally assessed her literacy levels. And around week 10 of this 15-week class, it came back that Nancy is not fully literate. We paired her with an educator to work on her assignments every week. And for the class, I scaled back the assignments so that she only had to be graded on the work that she could do with the tutor in her 1 hour time slot. And for example, in the 15-question final, that was a take-home final, Nancy submitted 5 questions, which might not describe you to surprise anyone, since we've described Nancy as not fully literate. And since we're talking about grades, eventually I gave her a C-. I can't fail. Her work was not up to par by any shape of the imagination, but I've never had a student work this hard. And if I fail her, she doesn't have access to this education, which is what she's seeking. So I settled, I believe, on a C-. And this is the part where, and this part of this talk I've kind of had laid out of what I'm going to do since I figured out I was doing this talk since December. And the rest of this I have found really hard because I've been waiting to find a conclusion to this story that is in some way positive. We are in New York. She came from a New York City high school. She graduated with a New York City high school diploma. And I realize New York City high schools are spotty, but I do not know how you graduate with a New York City high school diploma without being able to read. This is a few months later, and this fact still floors me. And there's no formal assessment process to place students at BMCC for English. And we rightfully take everyone. And Nancy, in her time, as she's in her 3rd semester at BMCC, and she's passed enough of her classes that she has an A in psychology, a B and C in speech, and she has a number of C's and C- and failed a few others. Right now, she's on academic probation because her grade point average is 7.15. Even still, even with a professor recommendation, she does not qualify for remedial classes at BMCC. And because Nancy graduated with a New York City high school diploma, she doesn't need to take the placement tests. So this option to take the remedial classes was never open for her and can never be open for her, even though the ESL program at BMCC says that she's not fully literate. At a certain point, it just seems like a waste of resources that she's taking mainstream classes which do not serve her. And there were other problems along the way. She had problems with financial aid because I don't think she fully understood how to fill out these forms. So she has to be at BMCC this semester to pay for last semester, as well as an additional issue. So this is the place of fracture. There's no easy path. After a lot of cul-de-sacs, I've eventually have gotten Nancy hooked up with the Office of Accessibility. And again, there are really amazing people there. And looking back at my journey through this process, I'm wondering what I could have done differently and what happens elsewhere, because this has to happen. This cannot be, while this is an extreme example, low literacy levels are not a unique, isolated event. Eventually I found her IEP, a really threadbare IEP, which didn't really illuminate anything. After the class, I kept on staying in touch, trying to find a better pathway. And maybe this talk is also a lament, because I'm not sure I really learned anything. That at BMCC, at least, there's really no pathway for her. The only way to qualify for remedial English classes is to be without a high school English diploma or have a high school English degree from another country, and not be a native English speaker. If you enter the system and then you start to struggle, there doesn't seem to be a way to get back. So I'm rather at the end of this talk. There are no key lessons learned. The stats are 25% of the students who enroll at BMCC go on to a 4-year university. So I like to believe that the system allows over 3,000 students a year to find a pathway to a 4-year college, and probably many other students are benefited greatly. The system seems to be failing a lot of the students who aren't finding their way through. And so I'm going to leave this here and ask for a conversation of what can be done better? What can I do better?
Okay, thank you, Meredith. And I certainly hope we can bring up some of these problems in the discussion period at the end. So finally, we have Carla Elaine Johnson, who is a faculty member in the English department at the St. Paul College campus in the Minnesota State System in St. Paul, Minnesota. She holds a doctoral degree in Russian literature from the Ohio State University, a certification in Russian translation from the University at Albany, SUNY, and a master's degree in English creative writing from the University of Minnesota. Her publications are in the areas of memoir, essay, and poetry. She teaches English, literature, and creative writing. Her academic research interests include pandemic teaching and learning, developmental writing, online learning, the memoir, the graphic novel, and the adult learner. And her current research studies include utilizing the synchronous online learning environment to increase student engagement, knowledge retention, and success. So her talk today is entitled Reinvention of the Teacher, the Camera is as Classroom.
Thank you so much. Greetings from Minnesota. And I wanted to actually, well, first, I wanted to say thank you, Meredith, because your situation very much reflects what we see in many places, including at St. Paul College. And I should start by saying that St. Paul College is in its going into third year as an anti-racist, trauma-informed institution. So as such, that does impact what we teach. And I decided after that, but not because of that, the murder of George Floyd, that I would be adding more to the classroom. There's a program called Min Reflect, which is specifically for community college instructors, or you can be at a 4-year college, but it was meant for research. And it was one of those rare things where the state actually would fund it. And it's a 2-year project. With the first semester, you are starting with figuring out your research project, which I knew pretty much what mine was going to be. I thought it was great. Student-teacher rapport. We're a majority minority institution. No problem. My research study was actually going to be done in March of 2020. Well, January. And in March, of course, it was halfway through. So I had half of my research And then we switched to online. So that wrecked that study. Redo it fall of 2020. A lot of the problems that were mentioned were ones that came up. Meredith mentioned some of them, and I feel for Nancy. I've had many students like her. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to redo this again after just to see what it's like fully online, because we went completely offline for a year and a half. We are only just starting to come back to campus. Most of my classes are taught remotely, and out of an abundance of caution, we are a community and technical college, so the trades get it. You know, most people don't have hydraulic lifts at home, so they get to have the campus and we can do our stuff off campus. I entitled this The Reinvention of the Teacher, the Camera as Classroom, because for many of us, the camera is where students are going to come and meet with us. During my original study for COVID, during COVID, I found that sometimes students were ashamed of their learning, their actual places where they learned. I had students, one of my most memorable one, he was one of 12 children, and 6 of them were going to various colleges. He thought less of himself because he was attending a community college. The only place that he could actually view was from the bunk bed he shared with his brother. And so we would have a one-on-one conference. I would see him just like I'm seeing each of you, but during class, his video was never on. So one of the things I found during this is that although my original question, the first study was on classroom techniques to increase student-teacher rapport, I then took it a step further to ask, how does Zoom help? One of the things it does is that I did 2 student surveys to see how students felt about just class in general, how they got along with each other, with me, start of the semester, end of the semester. Had conferences, had midterm written reports, and the goal was a conclusion survey during finals. Spring 2020 was wrecked. Fall 2020 was so-so. I decided to redo the whole thing with 4 classes, all of my classes in the fall of 2021, which would have been great, except that 10 days in the middle of the semester, I had emergency surgery. So once again, I had half a semester and then have to go to the other half. It gets better, really, Angela, it does get better. Because I decided to redo it with longer for the spring. Instead of having half semester courses, we run a 16-week semester with week 17 for finals. And this time, it so far has been working. And I would, so part of it, so I can actually, I don't want to play it. I actually want to share this so you can actually see some of the text that I was using or have been using on here. So one of the things is that I had, this is what I had for the study design format. And I use these texts because it's Baldwin, the collected essays, and the last interview and other conversations I use for both Composition 1 and Composition 2. Jose Angel Araguz's An Empty Pot's Darkness, great poetry collection, and Mary Moore Easter's Free Papers, poems inspired by the testimony of Eliza Winston, a Mississippi slave freed in Minnesota in 1860, also are ones that I've used with Composition 2. One of the things I found out, my goal in using this with the camera was to actually talk about very sensitive subjects. I felt that's easier if students could see me and could also work with each other. They had the anonymity of discussions online, but it really helped to have that almost face-to-face contact. These are the ones that we were using in terms of literary theories. So I ran the whole gamut with them. And it's compressed. I always include a dealer's choice for students. Some students, depending on their personal backgrounds, love reader response. Formalism, almost everyone wanted to do either feminist gender or queer theory, especially queer theory. Post-colonialism and critical race theory, I was very sensitive because when I was running it last semester and then this semester, I'm very conscious of the, how do I put this? The blowback against various theories as though this is hard and that this is somehow going to tear people apart. I think personally not having an awareness of history caused a problem. And speaking of history, one of the things I found with this particular grouping was how, as I went through the various Baldwin essays, and these are the ones I've covered most, with the last interview and other conversations being the final four, I found that students grew more comfortable with me and with each other because of how Baldwin presents issues. He doesn't sugarcoat things. He is a little more difficult to read, but students, especially immigrant students, loved Baldwin once they took the time to have it. And I figured out that slowing down was going to be helpful with it. Here is a sample of Encounter on the Seine, Black Meets Brown. I would use pre-class questions and in class challenge students to say, okay, well, let's talk about this. Let's go through using breakout rooms. The students actually had a better understanding. I tried to put as much as I could into the class because, like many of you have mentioned, our students have difficulties. Technology is not always the best. Fortunately, the classes tended to be during the day. For some, the ones that were at night was when campus was still open, so they could go to campus if they were having difficulties accessing. Earlier in the pandemic, full disclosure, I had students who were sitting in their cars trying to find a hotspot, and that tore my heart out. So I tried to reframe it so that here's how I can make it easier for the student to access the classroom and the camera. If you notice here, I have links. I'm not going to play them. Odetta is a folk singer. So since Baldwin's mentioning various lines when he would write, sometimes I feel like a motherless child, I would include the YouTube link. I would play the music in the Zoom classroom and leave the links on, we use D2L Blackboard, D2L Brightspace. I would leave the links up so students could actually go back and hear. I would encourage them to play the music in the background while they were reading Baldwin. And how did they feel about that? A little hokey at first, but some students actually liked it quite a bit. This is an example of what I did with Nothing Personal, where I had various links. And so the introduction included Another Day's Journey. There were a number of versions of Another Day's Journey. I just picked the Shirley Caesar version, and I picked the LaShawn Pace version, only because that's the shortest one. And I've Been Buchan, I've Been Scorned, which many of you might have heard from Alvin Ailey's Revelations Part 1, Pilgrim of Sorrow. All of these are on YouTube. And in playing parts of them, students could get a feel for what Baldwin is. And they also could talk about how they were responding and reacting. The use of the camera enabled greater engagement in the classroom. I also started using just as separate Zoom meeting rooms, which really helped if students had questions at the end that they would want to do one-on-one. Again, some were a bit shy about responding publicly, but weren't so shy when it was one-on-one, either with another student or with me. And so I took that as a win. I took anything as a win. Complications, as I mentioned before, fluctuations in student work-life balance. I'd started with 2 full-term classes, Composition 1, and the goal was for 4 classes, but the last 2 were going to begin October 26. I'm still frustrated with the efforts to equalize technology access. Usually they would have Chromebooks, but what would happen if they ran out? Some students still have difficulties because they believe they have to do it at home. And depending on where you live in the Twin Cities area, and some were remote, they don't have as much access. There's also a lot of Zoom fatigue, which is why I was redoing the study in the spring, because students were just kind of and not quite getting it. However, there are good outcomes. Positive student response, because we're addressing issues of culture, race, and historical context. The pre-class thought questions were great. Accessible links were terrific. From a teaching standpoint, the biggest lessons I learned were that it is easier in using the camera when less is actually brought up. Discoveries, I found that there was a sensitivity that I could convey both in either in person, face to face, but more importantly via Zoom, because students would see me and we go through, and I wouldn't hold back my own emotions, and that's really important. And so the students had more engagement. I've gone over some of the positives. Again, the biggest one, having student-led breakout room sessions, planning less for class session, retention. Struggling students, I found, stayed with the class longer. And I would privately discuss with students if they were going to have their video on or off. That's a whole nother presentation as to the etiquette of what do you do when a student is trying to work as a cashier, this actually happened, and attend class at the same time. It becomes a problem with participation because I'm teaching English. It's not a class where you can't have engagement with other students. Surveys, fall 2021, 30% spring, 40% for the data. During the beginning, I have not obviously gotten to the end, that's another month. I looked at asynchronous, Zoom synchronous classes. The lack of immediacy for asynchronous was the biggest problem. So I've tried to compensate with videos. Top tips: that Zoom can be wonderful. It helps to have individual take the time to actually have one-on-one conversations with folks about, do you understand Zoom? What about Zoom technology? And having them students as co-educators, using D12 Brightspace or your preferred course management system to its best advantage, so students can see it whenever they need to and can also ask questions. There was the very first presentation had here, let's have a session, a place where you can write to me. I love having those because students do access those and I can look at them and go back and then make plans accordingly. The auto assign feature on Zoom, great feature. I don't want to do it manually. It makes it a lot easier than randomness. Recording policy, my policy is everyone should be able to record anything. I don't care if you record me. I do care if you record other students because of privacy. And students are very nice about it. I do use audio transcript, cloud recording in Kaltura for engagement, formative questions in Zoom, whiteboard for copying things so it's done in real time. And I found that the class can be an anchor for students, for those who actually are deciding, yep, I think I'm gonna, hang in there. I do find, in response to Meredith, you were talking about what's happening, having the conversation. I do believe that, oh, thank you. I do believe that, Naomi, you were bringing up a lot of things because I'm like, yes, you basically are talking in my life. And the same thing with Jessica. I find that this particular presentation forced me to go back and look at what it means to teach in a forever altered Zoom environment. Because the reality is we're not going to be on campus face-to-face permanently for a very long time, if ever. And so that's, so I hope this is helpful. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Carla, Elaine. I think all four of those presentations gave us lots to think about, and it's also a reminder to me how lucky we are to have Zoom just for this conference so that we can come together across states and not have to spend hundreds of dollars doing so, even as much as I'd like to be in an actual room with you all. So we have 12 to 14 minutes for questions. It's not a lot of time. That's just the reality. So I'll open it up. If you have a question or a comment for any of the panelists, you can just raise your Zoom hand and I'll call on you. Or if you'd like to type in the chat, I can also read out questions or comments from there. Carla, Elaine.
A couple actually question and comment. First, to Naomi, I love your idea. You actually are wrestling with the very thing that I wrestle with. And my question was about when you were letting go of certain policies, how did you effectively implement it? And was there any resistance from administration? Because there's this whole thing of, we want to do what's best for the student, but we also have to come up against, well, retention, and are they staying in if you're doing this policy, but is it going up against financial aid policies and everything else? I'm just curious as to how you've handled it with your campus.
I didn't alert anyone to any changes that I was making, and so far I haven't had to defend myself. I hope that'll continue to be the case. I mean, I do still have to, do the mandated attendance reporting, midway through the semester. I always make sure to reach out to students ahead of that happening, so that if there are students who have stopped coming or who have stopped submitting, if they respond to an email, I count that as an attendance, and I allow that to count for them being in attendance because they've been in touch with me or updated me about their circumstances, or made an agreement with me about getting an assignment in by some future date. So I have some workarounds in sort of that sort of formal reporting that has to happen for attendance. And if I don't hear from them, then I mark them as not attending. But yeah, so far I haven't received any pushback from, the department level or higher up. But and I think because partly it's helped retention. I'm losing fewer students this way than I was before, and so I don't know that there's anything for them to complain about, really.
Thank you.
I see Claire's hand.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I really enjoyed all of these presentations. I wanted to just tap into something that Meredith Randall was discussing. And, I think we've all had students like Nancy, and we've also obviously been through the sort of transition from away from quote unquote remedial courses. And we now have co-requisites, so to speak. I'm still a little, sort of undecided about this. I mean, in a way, I think what I'm going to throw out there is, is my questioning of what a community college should be. I mean, I was in a meeting the other day, and I sort of threw out to the other chairs of the departments, why don't we have an automotive course here? Why can't somebody come here to learn how to work on cars? Why isn't there a carpentry class, either for professions or I said once I was trying to find a simple class to learn how to be sort of, the average car owner working on her own car. And there's just no such thing in New York City. I know there is in other community colleges, but it just made me question the function of what we're doing, and why don't we, why is there this sort of gap between what I'm presuming that Meredith was saying, that Nancy's public school education in New York City really failed her in some ways. And then there's this sort of void in between, this giant abyss where there's nothing for her to bring her up to par. And who knows why she was not fully literate. And then you get to BMCC, where everything is very academically oriented. I find that a little bit frustrating. I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about that. And certainly there are arguments on both sides, of course. But it just seems like you ought to be able to go somewhere and get the help that you need. I mean, when I was in college, I'm a pretty good student, I'm terrible in math. And there was no help for me. This was 1,000 years ago, there was no help for me, believe it or not, at the University of Georgia as an undergraduate. I'm sure there is now. But I needed remedial help in math. And I just struggled through very unhappily through the 2 required courses that I had to get through. Does anybody have any ideas about whether maybe there should be some sort of, even credit bearing
help? There is remedial help at BMCC for math, and you have to take a exam to get into math at BMCC. There's none for English.
Yeah, I'm very frustrated by that. And I think there are programs, but some of the work that we can put our students into is not credit bearing. And I think that's the problem, is that they, we no longer should be able to ask students to do work where it doesn't bear some kind of credit. Also, we're very, very tight as a community college. It's only 2 years here, basically. So some of our majors don't have any, there are no electives. It's so tight, they can't even take an elective.
And they differentiate between credit hours. So if you're taking remedial classes, you can still get financial aid.
Right.
This is a credit bearing class. So it works. I mean, part of it's money, cynically, of what they can charge for. But it seems to me to be ludicrous that there's no backwards button to get remedial help for students who wind up in a trajectory that they're wholly unqualified to undertake.
To be on. Yeah, exactly. I think my comment, Meredith, is just to express my frustration and not really to have anything very sensible to say. But I thank you all very much for your presentations.
Yeah, thanks so much. So in the 6 minutes we have Angie and then Manya.
Mine is really short, and it's sort of the other side of a previous question for Naomi. I had a lot of success when I was in the online environment, taking away late penalties for work. My students found it motivating. They turned in things even when they were really behind. I had a higher success rate, etc. When I went back to the classroom, that same motivating factor doesn't seem to be working. And I don't know if it's just something about this semester. A lot of my colleagues seem to be suggesting that this is our first semester where lots of people are back in person. And there seems to be just a general malaise. And I don't know what that's about, or at least having spoken to some of my colleagues, that seems to be the case. But I actually had pushback from students over it, as in students basically saying, students who didn't take the option not to turn something in on a due date, complaining that other students had and that it wasn't fair. And it was like, but you had the same option to take more time if you needed it. And I'm just trying to figure out, I don't even know. I don't even know if this is a question, but it just seems very strange to me that some of the things that seemed to work really well and be motivating when students were kind of in this, we're all in this together kind of sense that they felt when we were online and sort of forced to be online. They seemed to see a lot of this as sort of emergency, and we're all just going to get through this. And somehow we got back into the physical classrooms, and some of that sort of sense of solidarity seemed to dissipate into disgruntlement. I don't know. And it's unfortunate because it does seem that, and warranted disgruntlement, don't get me wrong. But it just, I'm concerned because there seems to actually be more struggling in some ways now that we're getting back in person, which I'm not sure how to deal with.
No, I'm definitely feeling that too. This is my first semester teaching in person again. I have 2 in person and 2 online, and I did, for the first time since I started doing this in 2020, I had a student really angry that, that she's staying on top of everything. She's meeting every deadline. And I had sort of, in class announced, some of you haven't submitted the paper yet, just a reminder, schedule a meeting with me if you need help. And she was like, I can't believe people haven't turned it in yet. I had it in on time, and, this isn't fair. And so she's only one. I have this, so I don't know if other students are feeling that and not expressing it, or, but yeah, there does seem to have been a shift, and I'm certainly feeling that malaise in my in-person courses much more than the ones that are still online. I'm not sure if that's, I certainly also have been feeling anxious about my return. So I don't know how much of it is just not being used to being back in the classroom yet. And especially for the students, I think they had sort of grown accustomed to being in their little black Zoom box and maybe not being expected to engage in the same ways that I'm expecting them to in the classroom. So I don't know if I have an answer for this, but just solidarity. I'm experiencing the same things in the return to face-to-face.
Yeah, I think this just reminds me how important it is to have these conversations. And as Jessica said in the chat, to talk about how ungrading or contract grading can actually address this problem of student competition, and just like the fact that we can let the system divide us if we aren't open and transparent with these policies. So just for one final question, I think, Manya.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. So just that it's really for panels like this that we made this conference. We years ago, like, and maybe just something about the universal and the particular, because I love, I mean, I think we're all touched by the radical teaching of empathy. It was like we, you know, and of the, and ungrading, and the choices, Carla Lane, that you had, the pedagogical choice, or the syllabus choices. And at the same time, like the issue of Nancy, like we have an idea of what we're doing, and then we have the Nancy in the classroom, right? And it's and even I can't even say the Nancy, because I had this Nancy, and this Nancy is at maybe a third grade reading level. I mean, she really can't read, and one of the problems, and it's a it's an economic real problem. People passed her in 101. Somebody passed her. So once she was passed in 101, she cannot write, she cannot read. So once she was passed, she was in my 201 class. I had to fail her. She had to fail the class. On the other hand, we're at this because she can't read and write. So on the other hand, she needs the financial aid to stay in college. So somebody, for example, like, because she can't write in it. So like, what do? Do we pass the student when we have those students so that they can stay there and keep going? Yes, maybe sometimes, maybe not in 201, maybe we keep her in 101. But sometimes we have people passing students who need to learn the skill, who are not learning it. And it's a larger conversation about economics and these poorly served students, and how we're going to best take care of them, that I think still needs that conversation still needs to continue. But wait, no, I have one more thing to say. Meredith was incredible. She wrote maybe 1,000 emails. She just would keep emailing. She didn't care that nobody answered her. She would find somebody else. I never saw anything like it. It made me like, I was like, Meredith, please adopt me. Like, it was the most, she was like this radical. She would not let people ignore this student. And it was extremely moving. And I just want to say that publicly. It was really fantastic. She was fantastic. Okay. Thank you all. Sorry, board. I just got excited by that.
Oh, not at all. That's fantastic. And actually, I realize it is a lunch break now. We don't have to rush to other panels, but we all probably do need a break. So I'm open if people want to hang around for a few minutes, or go get a drink of water, eat some lunch. Any of that sounds great to me. But I would like first to thank everyone again for being part of this exciting panel, and giving me so many ideas about how to approach my grading policies and other sorts of course content, and just practicing radical empathy in the classroom in the future, with the understanding that COVID is not over, and B, these inequalities have existed before COVID and they will continue to exist. And so we can't pretend that everything's going back to normal.
I love this idea of radical empathy. I've been calling it grace, but radical empathy sounds perfect. I might quote you.
Now you know why I
Yes.
use the word love so many times in my opening remarks. I mean, this is an expression of love for our students and love for what we do and what we try to do. And I, again, really appreciate it. Thank you all.
And thank you, Jessica and Naomi, for putting things in the chat. I did want to follow up with Manya just to say that specifically what you're talking about, we do have different measures, and there is a movement. I don't think it's just Minnesota. They are wanting to eliminate reading, and we have reading departments and reading faculty to put it in, yes, co-requisites, and also teaching the same. I've done those. It's a lot of extra work on the writing faculty to do that, to make sure students get through. The reading faculty are torn because they are, in essence, losing their jobs unless they can recertify to teach English. And on top of that, sadly, someone like a Nancy at St. Paul College, because she has a high school diploma And would even without multiple measures, if her GPA were 2.5 at her high school, she could go into Comp 1. She could self-select because students are allowed to do that. And they did it for the pandemic. And then they decided, oh, our old thing was to go through testing, but we tossed out AccuPlacer. People think that it's unfair. And I agree, it can be unfair, classist, racist, however you want to call it, for AccuPlacer, depending on the questions. I think it's worse if you've got someone who has to be failed because she was passed on and should have been passed on in the first place.
Right.
And we cannot put, if someone comes to my Comp 1 class, I can't say, you know, you really need Fund 2 or Fund 1. Please register for that class. I can suggest it. I can't force them to go to that class, which means I either have to fail them or I have to bend over backwards to try to get this person through at a passing rate, which affects our individual health as people who teach. And that's not fair.
Right. Right.
So thank you for bringing that up. And thank you, Meredith, for your devotion. So I'll remember that.
I don't recommend it, but like, I felt bad. No one had done, I mean, like, how do you get to be 19 and you can't read and you've lived in New York City for 11 years? It seems like you can't do anything. No, she was actually illiterate in both languages because she came here when she was 9, and she wasn't fully literate yet in Bengali, and she wasn't fully literate in English. It was this kind of perfect storm of multiple failures.
I've had other students talk about that. It sounds like maybe she had, on top of just,
I mean, there's
not having,
issues.
not having sort of gotten herself up to par in Bengali, she might have had a learning disability. But my very high functioning students have told me how they are neither all that good in English, and these are the words they use, both spoken and written, and not all that good in Spanish, which is the language they speak at home, like with their mothers and grandmothers, because they're constantly moving back and forth between the two sort of realms. And you know, they, especially if their education is in English, you know, in public schools, but their spoken language is Spanish or some other language at home, they never really learn to write very well in Spanish, but their English is still sort of, you know, I don't know what the word is, deterred, you know. So she had that plus, it sounds like. I still say, though, it makes me mad that we can't find some way to make a home for these people to increase their skills and to catch up. I mean, you know, she doesn't have to expect to be, you know, I don't know, who can I say, you know, Herman Melville at the end of it all, but she can increase her literacy and increase her sort of functioning. Anyway, I'm just repeating myself. Thank you all very, very much. I'll see you again, you know, see you on the radio a little later.
1:30. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, everybody. It was great.
Take care.
So much.
Thanks,
See you later.
everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
For all the references in the chat.
I loved it.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Take care.